I can't remember if it was 1 or 2 years ago that Jai Bhattacharya came to Melbourne. Was it 1 or 2 years? Seems a long time ago. Once upon a time. And we had an event that was sold out in Melbourne with 500 people in attendance. And there was a series of things. But that began, as the lights dimmed, with a video presentation, short video presentation from Gigi, because she couldn't physically come. And I still remember the spontaneous, loud, unanimous applause from the entire audience when they saw her name and photo appear before she said a word. And I thought if she had seen that, she might have quit ahead and not said anything after that, in case it got diluted. So thanks, Gigi. It is lovely to meet so many people who essentially now, I'm going to put this on this. Thank you. Essentially now constitute our new family. And that is important. Mrs. Thakur, Jeffrey, before I start, and related to what I just said, let me pose a question for all of you to ponder. How many people around the world have been helped to retain their sanity and perhaps even avoid serious self-harm by the existence of entities like the Brownstone Institute here and the Daily Skeptic in the UK? So it really is a great pleasure for me and a privilege to meet so many of you in person whose writings I've been reading and have been inspired by and felt a sense of affinity across the oceans in these dark and troubled times. Ladies and gentlemen, it's a sign of the times that this age-old greeting is condemned as evidence of far-right extremism, wrongthink, hate speech, even little violence, saying ladies and gentlemen. My talk is entitled COVID in the Age of Woke. Now, I apologize in advance to anyone who may be offended by anything I say. All I can say in my defense is that I actually am an equal opportunity offender. I do not discriminate in my offense on grounds of religion, ethnicity, race, gender, whatever. So if I don't get to you tonight, give me time, I will get to you. Back in May, Jeffrey wrote a thoughtful essay on the 12 challenges that remain to be addressed in the world shattered by COVID. I still struggle to understand how we got into that world in the first place. Of COVID-era lockdowns, masks and vaccine mandates. Toby Young, the founder of the Daily Skeptic in the UK, has argued that the pink conquistadors may not be in office, but they are very much in power and populate most civic, political, corporate, media, and sporting institutions in the professional and managerial groups. Their worldview and value system has become the ascendant religion in Western societies. Those who would challenge the metaphysical beliefs and rules of the holy woke empire are the minority cultural deviants. In June, July this year, we had the extraordinary confirmation of this in a possibly watershed case of peak woke. The well-known but not universally liked British politician Nigel Farage was debanked by Coote, the word of the year, by the way, debanked. A subsidiary of NatWest that is 39% government-owned in the UK. The bank initially tried to ride out the furore with silent treatment, then lied about the reason for their action by leaking quietly to a BBC senior journalist, and generally just kept digging the hole deeper. The culture wars is no longer something waged only by right-on teachers and theatre groups. Rather, says Alison Pearson, the woodworm of woke is gnawing away at the foundations of all our institutions. I want to argue tonight that the spreading dominance of the woke agenda was a key enabling environment in 2020 for the COVID interventions. Wokeism is a war on Western civilization. Resisting the COVID tyranny is a war to defend such products of Western enlightenment as individual-centric civil liberties, political freedoms, human rights, and empirical science. As a somewhat lesser man than Jeffrey, I don't have 12 propositions, but I do have 11 pathways on the journey from the kingdom of woke to the dystopia of COVID restrictions. Just so you don't get too worried about my ambitious agenda for tonight, like Henry VIII said to each one of his 6 wives, I promise not to keep you long. Let me give you 3 examples of the convergence of the 2 agendas. In March, the WHO's Strategic Advisory Group of experts issued a revised roadmap for prioritizing the use of COVID vaccines in a document that refers to pregnant persons. In May, Pfizer endorsed the Australian government's proposed constitutional amendment that was defeated recently 60-40 and in all 6 states to entrench an Aboriginal voice that would have racialized our foundational governance construct. The chief medical officer when COVID struck Australia, Dr. Brendan Murphy, is now the Secretary of Health. In Australia, that's a bureaucratic post, not a political post, by the way. In that capacity, at a Senate hearing last year, he refused to define a woman because the issue, he said, is a very contested space. 3 months later, his department offered up a 78-word salad definition that reads like it was cobbled together by a fresh gender studies graduate. It occurred to me recently that perhaps we could send him to Hamas to learn the difference between a man and a woman. So proposition 1, the corruption of science. The first and most important parallel is the manner in and extent to which science itself has been corrupted. Common elements include all existing science, knowledge and understandings of males and females were overturned. This preconditioned people to accept throwing out a century's experience, science and policy settings on pandemics. This was done with lightning speed in the context of the extremely long arc of history on the woke agenda regarding the definitions of men, women, family, marriage, etc. And with the speed of science, with lockdowns, masks, and vaccine developments and mandates. Technocrats and experts insist they know best. Governments are brainwashed and intimidated into changing laws at the behest of shouty groups. These laws are then used to coerce citizens into compliance. Biologists and medical practitioners medical personnel became complicit in science denialism on gender self-ID through career-protecting silence. COVID policies gave them the opportunity to rinse and repeat. In other words, the rapid march of wokeism was met, by and large, with inertia, complacency, ideological confusion, and moral cum intellectual cowardice. Preconditioned into compliance with anti-scientific rubbish, in order to show our caring side, we were ripe for the pandemic-triggered biosecurity state. Dr. Anthony Fauci, what a man. Mr. Science himself. For 3 years, I've been trying to fix on the word, the single word that best captures him. And the winner is a word I recently came across. Most of you may know it, I hadn't heard of it before. It's a word called cockwomble. The definition by Cambridge Dictionary is, and I quote, a foolish, obnoxious person prone to making outrageously stupid statements and inappropriate behavior, yet with a very high opinion of his own wisdom and importance, unquote. Now, if I had to choose Mr. Science, it would be Jay Bhattacharya. If you want to hear an extremely embarrassing story about him, talk to me afterwards. For now, let me just say, deep knowledge of epidemiology, commitment to grounding theory in empirical research, professional integrity, courage of convictions, unassuming, and a thoroughly decent and nice person. Even if he cannot pronounce his own name. Fauci is the only person I know of who possibly believes himself divine. He reminds me of the following story from the days of the Caliphate, the original Caliphate in Baghdad. At a weekly public court hearing, a man is brought in chains to the Caliph. He looks at the guards and says, "What's the charge?" "Sire, this man claims to be God." That charge caught even the Caliph's attention. Turned around, looked with great interest at the man in chains and said, "Is this true?" "What, sire?" "That you claim to be God." "Yes, sire, that is true." "Why do you claim to be God?" "Because I am God." "Well, that's very interesting. Last week, they brought to me a man in chains who said he was a messenger of God." "What did he do, sire?" "I had him beheaded." "You are a very wise Caliph, sire. I hadn't sent him." Now, there is a certain allure to that image, isn't there? Our friend brought to court in chains to face justice. Never mind. Who among the icons of the movement's pioneers would have believed that in the 2020s, feminists would be fighting over the right to call themselves women? The phrase pregnant persons was used 64 times in the WHO's abortion care guidance published in March last year. Why would we accept this organization as an authority on medical science and take any of its medical advice seriously? Second parallel, silencing and cancellation of dissent. The full force of stifling intellectual conformity and punishment of scientific dissent has been felt, as we heard over the day, by critics of COVID lockdowns. Regulators threatened dissenting doctors with professional disciplinary action, and the threat was indeed carried out in just a few instances. Their modest numbers does not invalidate the tactic. Authorities successfully adopted Sun Tzu's advice to kill one, terrify 1,000. The new Science TM on cultural issues and pandemic interventions is enshrined in legislation and diktats of the administrative state, and enforced by the state as well as through mechanisms of social control and psychological nudging. All dissent is ruthlessly suppressed, and dissenting voices are silenced and cancelled. Yet, as we know, science is a work in progress, not an encyclopedia of facts. Although the long arc of science bends towards truth, progress is neither linear nor irreversible. Diversity viewpoints on contested elements of knowledge and rejection of attempts to suppress dissenting voices provide necessary safeguards against reverses of knowledge. If the infrastructure of the surveillance state and collusion of the censorship industrial complex had been available to authorities and gatekeepers of public morals and knowledge in previous eras, we would all still be flat earthers. To paraphrase Churchill on Munich, on lockdowns, masks, and vaccines, faced with a choice between dishonor and fighting for principle, most universities chose dishonor and have got and will get a fight. Three, cult of safety. Western kids, it seems to me, are the equivalent of Prince Siddhartha, also known as the Buddha after their enlightenment. Shielded from any exposure to life's miseries and sorrows, the most insulated of any generation from any calamity, obsessing over modeled forecast threats, microaggressions, need for trigger warnings, and counseling if someone uses the N-word. I don't understand how they know what it means if they've never been exposed to it, but never mind. Petrified by imaginary threats well beyond the time horizon of their life cycle. Living in misophobia, dissenting speech is hate speech, offending speech is literal violence, people with different moral frameworks are super haters, etc. The sway of safetyism creates demand for safe spaces and the right not to be hurt and offended. It's a short distance from this in the culture wars to the demands on the state to protect people from the terrifying new virus. That short distance was covered in a sprint. 4, threat inflation. I've come around to the view that environmentalism is part and parcel of wokery, starting with moralism. To believe in the anthropogenic destruction of the natural world helps to define a moral and civilized human being. Framing climate policy as a moral imperative permits the imposition of any individual and societal cost and harm as the necessary price to pay. Non-believers can and should be subjected to public mockery and banished from polite society. Science has been collapsed into abstract mathematical modeling built on a priori assumptions. No amount of empirical anomalies in observable data can discredit and invalidate the science. Instead, because of the moralism infusing it, dissidents must be defenestrated from the priesthood as heretics. Read the whistleblower equivalent expose by Patrick Brown on why only bias-confirming research may be published in the proper journals. And climate science departments, research institutes, and policy think tanks must be purged of all contrarians. This ensures the purity of the approved narrative is not corrupted and the science remains, quote-unquote, settled. In order to connect the science to policy action, the scale, gravity, and imminence of the apocalyptic threat must be exaggerated. Antonio Guterres has joined the ranks of the catastrophists. On 27 July, he declared the era of global warming has ended and the era of global boiling has arrived. On 20th September, he was back to alarmism because, quote, humanity has opened the gates to hell, gates, G with a capital G, by the way, with stubborn inaction on climate change. This raises a question in terms of the metaphors we use. Thanks. Is it more appropriate to recall the boy who cried wolf or Goebbels? Serial false warnings means people fail to respond when the threat does materialize, versus a big lie repeated enough times becomes the truth. An unpleasant experience doesn't make you a survivor. In my day job, I study mass atrocities. I know what a survivor means. The use of the N-word in historical or literary context is a traumatic experience only if self-actualized. For healthy people of sound mind, insisting on biologically correct pronouns does not lead to thoughts of suicide. To gain public backing for the degree of state intrusion into people's private lives and control over nations' economic activities, the immediacy, gravity, and magnitude of the coronavirus threat had to be made apocalyptic. COVID-19 is not remotely as lethal as the Spanish flu. Our health systems and treatment options are infinitely better than a century ago. Yet authorities did not close down whole societies and economies in 1918. In other deadly pandemic episodes also, we suffered but endured. 5, deny or downplay harms of interventions. To militant woke activists, there seems to be no limit to the collateral harms that are accepted as mere roadkills on the highway to social justice heaven. Warnings of collateral harm of COVID interventions were dismissed as exaggerated, speculative, without evidence, etc. Yet evidence continues to mount on the many different pathways through which the Grim Reaper claims his growing mass of victims from the panicked responses to COVID. How many victims will it take before authorities move to protect women prisoners from manipulative and abusive male predators? How many children will be sacrificed on the altar of the brutal trans ideology before the medical profession calls a halt to unnecessary and risky treatment? As you heard through the day, ignoring the forest of safety signals flashing in bright neon lights, how many children will be sacrificed to vaccine harms before COVID vaccines are banned for healthy children and adolescents? how many poor children around the world missed out on life-saving immunization schedules. This is obviously an anti-vaxxer speaking. On life-saving immunization schedules and years of schooling because of lockdown restrictions that saved very few healthy young lives. Why was the QALY metric, the quality adjusted life years metric, abandoned for a disease with an exceptionally steep age gradient and cost-benefit analyses not done or not published? The only cost-benefit analysis we have in Australia even today is the one that Gigi did with colleagues. 6, quote unquote, her penis. Language matters. The debate on language is not an argument about human rights, but over truth and science versus lies and dogma. Lies can be turned into truth by laws. Who knew? The fight back must also begin with decolonizing language. We had a conflation of infection and case fatality rates. The counting of PCR positive results even at 40 CT as cases. Collapse of the distinction between dying with and of COVID. Redefinition of vaccines to circumvent the lack of sterilizing immunity, etc. Examples of virtue signaling language from the land of the woke are legion. Born male becomes assigned male at birth. Gender truthful people are dubbed gender critical by sympathizers and TERFs by critics. The UK Ministry of Justice has decreed that convicted criminals must not be called convicts, there goes Australian history, but persons of lived experience. Meanwhile, pedophiles are minor attracted persons. God help us, says an atheist, by the way. Language matters. Choice of words has empirical consequences for ordering society. Shelter in place camouflages the violence of mass house arrests. Gender affirming sounds not just innocuous, but actually positive, whereas female genital mutilation? What exactly is the difference between the two? On second thoughts, strike that question. I don't want to know. The precondition of the gender fluidity-driven changing social practices was the preferred pronouns initiative. Women's rights would not be under such severe threat if trans women were honestly described as biological males and correctly pronounced, as my neologism for the night. The war to protect women's identity, rights, and dignity is lost at the point where you accept the science fiction of addressing as she a 6'3" bearded man with a functioning male organ, which he will proudly display in a woman's spa, heedless of how embarrassed and offended the girls and women in the room might feel. Jordan Peterson was right all those years ago to reject government diktat on pronouns untethered to biological reality. Think of the enormity of the state compelling you by law to speak a biological lie, that you know to be a biological lie. On matters COVID, the most memorable public statement was former New Zealand Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern's demand that the Ministry of Health was the single source of truth. IPSO, the Independent Press Standards Organisation in the UK, made adverse findings against Peter Hitchens. After the lockdown files were published, he wrote, quote, "I intend to have a bronze medal struck, which I can wear on ceremonial occasions, recording this censure, intended as a rebuke and taken as an insult, but which I will in future regard as an honor," unquote. Change will not come until the majority turns on the spineless cowards at the top of social institutions and channels Howard Beale in network. We've had enough. We are not going to take it anymore. This is as true of woke as of COVID extremism. J.K. Rowling has courageously said in public she will go to jail for 2 years if a Labour government criminalizes misgendering. Seven, culture of censoriousness. The increasingly hegemonic set of ideologies has infiltrated and captured the classroom, boardroom, newsroom, and public and professional institutions, and morphed into cancel culture. Criticism, ridicule, sarcasm, an alternative point of view to the orthodoxy, all can be interpreted by someone, somewhere, on some occasion, as microaggression, hate speech, making them feel unsafe, etc. Rowan Atkinson, Mr. Bean, warned that we live in, quote, a creeping culture of censoriousness, that with a reasonable and well-intentioned ambition to contain obnoxious elements in our society, has created a society of an extraordinarily authoritarian and controlling nature, unquote. And I would add, one that is singularly devoid of any joy, pleasure, and cheer. Do you know any person who is woke who has a sense of humor? But which, after all, is Rowan Atkinson's forte. All this is equally applicable to the pandemic. Atkinson's address was 11 years ago. And that is my central argument tonight, that the syndrome he had identified became an essential enabling environment for the rise of, shall we say, Faucism. 8. Curtailment of free speech and civil liberties. I was first drawn very strongly to the Brownstone Institute and to Jeffrey's writings at the AIER before that, and drawn equally strongly with JG and a few other people initially to establishing the Australians for Science and Freedom. Because I believe, as strongly as I can state from the bottom of my heart, a free society cannot exist without free speech. Universities were bastions of critical inquiry that, operating behind impregnable ramparts of intellectual freedom, interrogated every kernel of received wisdom. Today's campuses, as we heard in one of the panels today, are the vanguard of efforts to enforce thought conformity through trigger warnings, microaggressions, deplatforming, and safe and therapy spaces. We've had therapy spaces in Australia after the voice referendum. Militant disruptors have acquired a heckler's veto over expression of critical opinion with respect to protected group rights based on race, religion, and gender identity. The voice vote, and this is its global historic significance, was the world's first referendum on identity politics. Similarly, lockdowns and mask and vaccine mandates were the most egregious and wide-ranging assault ever on the civil liberties, political freedoms, free speech, and human rights of citizens. When lockdowns were first instituted in Western countries, and we began discussing that in Australia, I still remember my reaction. If I have committed no crime and I'm a healthy person, Who the hell are you, the government, my enemy, to put me under house arrest? I mean, a court is not allowed to stop me and question me for anything without due reasonable cause. But you can lock me in my house when I'm healthy, I haven't committed no crime, and you can lock everyone else. You can stop me from seeing my family, my grandchildren. Get lost. Unchecked medical tyranny seemed hell-bent on destroying Western society of free peoples as we know it, with the presumption we are all sick, whether we know it or not, or will soon be sick, and we must all be dealt with as potential germ-ridden disease carriers who pose a constant threat to all others. The compulsion and coercion never had any ethical justification, and decisions should never have been left to the self-appointed custodians of the science. The medical justification propping them has also crumbled by now. Citizens have inalienable rights and freedoms. Governments have limited powers. Which part of this equation do governments not recognize? The unprecedented, no-limits intrusion of the state into the most intimate spaces of individual behavior and economic activity would have been unimaginable before COVID. Yet the first wave of restrictions on culturally sensitive topics helped to prepare the ground for the second wave of restrictions on COVID. 9, collective benefit trumps individual harms. This is deeply insidious, so bear with me on this argument. Individual human rights have been progressively subordinated to group-based collective and anti-discrimination laws. Public health, by definition, is a collective good. In the name of ensuring the safe health of everyone, governments trampled willy-nilly on previously inviolate individual rights. Western medicine has been predicated on the norm that the doctor's primary responsibility in assessing benefits against the risks of harms of treatment options is the welfare of the individual patient. The messaging on my house arrest, stroke masks, stroke vaccine protects you, and your house arrest, stroke mask, stroke vaccine protects me, turned this long-standing principle of Western medicine on its head. Vaccines were mandated on the slogan, "No one is safe until everyone is safe," ignoring the admission implicit in the slogan itself that they do not protect the vaccinated. Most Western governments succumbed to the fatal conceit that one group of citizens has the right to use coercion to set their personal protection as an absolute value and to disregard the safety values balance of others. The intersection of the cult of safety and the prioritization of the collective benefit over individual autonomy led us from the open society down the blind alley of a closed society. Have we normalized the use of centralized and concentrated power to extend the state guarantee of protection against feelings of some being hurt by words of others, the spread of viruses, and change of climate? Has this become the new normal? And that is my biggest worry going forward. 10, access of big state, big media, big tech. Anti-discrimination measures require legislative enactment and administrative enforcement by states. Edward Murrow warned prophetically, quote, "A nation of sheep will beget a government of wolves," unquote. To overcome the hesitations of history and experience, The threat from COVID had to be inflated in order to panic countries into drastic action. This was successfully done by state propaganda in alliance with the MSM, social media, and big tech. Lockdowns didn't kill the virus dead, but did destroy the 3 L's of lives, livelihoods, and liberties. In the name of keeping us all safe, the entire machinery of state was let loose upon citizens. Governments effectively stole 3 years of our lives. Now the social engineering is also being extended to cover the decarbonization agenda in pursuit of net zero goals. The 2 bookends for the parallel universes are represented by the freedom convoy of protesting truckers in Canada and the farmers' protests in the Netherlands. In the 2 cases, the laptop class and the middle and upper class and comfortably off young people engaged in disruptive, extreme climate activism have pitted themselves against the working class producing and moving goods from factories and farms to consumers. The instantly formed mass consensus on COVID policy, predicated in the liberal conceit that governments can control virus behavior, has delivered sicker, poorer, and unhappier populations. Similarly, net zero is bent on reversing the biggest global health, wealth, and education gains in history for the masses that was delivered by the Industrial Revolution powered by fossil fuel-based energy. We will all be poorer to satisfy the conceit that humans can operate the control knob of climate patterns. 11th, moralization and sacralization. 11th and final. Western publics strongly supported lockdown measures, masks, and vaccines, despite collateral harms, including loss of livelihoods, elevated mortality from neglect of other diseases and ailments, deaths of despair from greater loneliness, and police abuses. The explanation lies in the moralization of the restrictions that deepened into sacralization. The expansion of state power would have faced many more challenges but for the prior success in turning the debate from a scientific discourse into a moral imperative. Fear was instrumentalized to terrify, shame, and guilt citizens into staying home, isolating from colleagues, family, and friends, snitching on neighbors who broke lockdown and mask rules, and getting vaccinated. Those who asked for evidence to justify the biggest expansion of state power in Western political history were shamed as wanting to kill Granny. Yet, to my mind, selfish was demanding everyone be put under house arrest because I don't feel safe. Selfish was the rich outbidding poor countries for booster jabs before the latter had got primary jabs. Selfish was the petulant provincialism of state border closures so Queensland hospitals could be reserved for Queenslanders. Yes, the Premier of Queensland did actually say that. Selfish was the panic run on toilet paper rolls. Selfish was destroying the future of the young who are least at risk for a few more months of existing without living, by the elderly most at risk. The real policy challenge, in the words of Gabriel Bauer, is, quote, how can we protect grandma while also safeguarding dignified and purposeful living in a free world, unquote. So please, don't come a waltzing morality on me. Now, as we've discussed, the world faces many storm clouds. I've traversed a lot of ground on a sobering and dispiriting journey. Yet at heart, I am a congenital optimist. I think it's part of the job requirement for being a UN official. You have to believe in human improvement and perfectibility. So for any of you who are worried that with all these problems and pressures and threats and dangers, the world will come to an end tonight, let me remind you, it already is tomorrow in Australia. Thank you.